toast to the new wife.
Imagine spending 30 years inside a family that smiled at you across the dinner table, that called you daughter and sister and wife, all while quietly counting down the days until you were gone. Helen Carter did not have to imagine it. She lived it. And on the night they finally gathered to replace her, the night they seated a younger woman in her chair and lifted their glasses to a future that did not include her, Helen Carter said nothing at all. She did not weep. She did not beg. She did not raise her voice in that long, candlelit room. She simply folded her hands in her lap and watched them celebrate. Because Helen already knew something none of them did. Something that would, before the season was over, turn every smile in that room into ash. And to understand what she knew, you have to understand how she got there. This is the story of a woman the world decided to overlook. A woman so quiet, so unassuming, so easy to dismiss, that an entire family built their plans on the assumption that she would never fight back. They were wrong about her in almost every way a person can be wrong. They thought she was poor. They thought she was powerless. They thought the house they lived in was theirs, that the company that fed them was theirs, that the name they wore so proudly belonged to them and them alone. And while they whispered behind her back and arranged her quiet removal, not one of them stopped to ask a single, simple question. Whose name was actually on the papers? Whose signature held it all together? The answer to that question is the reason you are about to hear one of the most remarkable stories of betrayal and dignity you will ever encounter. There are 3 questions that sit at the heart of everything you are about to hear, and I want you to hold on to them as we go. The first is this. How does a loyal wife of 3 decades end up being replaced at her own dinner table, with her own husband sitting silent beside her? The second question is still stranger. How could one quiet, overlooked woman secretly own the very house, the very company, and the very fortune that her family believed belonged to them? And the third question, the one that will haunt you long after this story ends, is the most human of them all. When the truth finally came out, when Helen Carter held the power to destroy every person who had wronged her, what did she choose to do with it? Revenge was hers for the taking. Whether she took it is the heart of this story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you are about to hear did not begin on the night Helen was replaced. It did not begin with the younger woman, or the divorce papers, or the cold smiles around that table. To understand how it all came apart, you have to travel back more than 30 years, to a different time and a different Helen, a young woman with nothing to her name but a sharp mind, a careful heart, and a quiet kind of strength that the people around her would spend decades mistaking for weakness. Her story, like so many true stories, begins not with money or power, but with love. Helen grew up in a part of the country where families measured each other by the size of their homes and the age of their money. She had neither. Her father worked with his hands until those hands gave out, and her mother stretched every dollar until it screamed. What Helen had instead was an attention to detail that bordered on uncanny. She noticed things other people missed. The way a ledger did not quite add up. The way a man's promise did not quite match his eyes. She finished her schooling near the top of her class, took a modest job keeping books for a local firm, and learned, line by line, the secret language of money. How it moved. How it hid. How the people who had it almost never understood it half as well as the people forced to count every cent. That quiet education would one day change everything. But first, it brought her to Daniel. Daniel Carter was everything Helen was not. He came from one of the oldest families in the county, a family whose name sat on the side of a lumber and hardware company that had supplied half the homes in the region for 3 generations. Carter and Sons. The sign hung over the main road like a promise. Daniel was warm where his family was cold, gentle where they were proud, and from the first afternoon he met Helen, something in him recognized something in her. He saw the way her mind worked. He saw the steadiness behind her quiet. He fell in love with the very things his family would later despise her for, and when he brought her home to meet them, when he stood in the grand front room and announced that this was the woman he intended to marry, the temperature in that house dropped 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. His mother, Patricia Carter, was the kind of woman who could wound you with a smile. She had spent her entire life guarding the family name like a dragon guards gold, and in Helen she saw everything she feared. A girl with no money. No pedigree. No useful connections. A girl who would, in Patricia's mind, drag the Carter name down into the ordinary. She did not forbid the marriage, because she was far too clever for anything so blunt. Instead, she did something quieter and far more lasting. She decided, that very first evening, that Helen would never truly belong. And over the years that followed, with 1,000 small cuts and 1,000 cool silences, she made certain that everyone in the family understood the rule. Helen could live among them. She could serve them, smile for them, and sit at their table. But she would never be one of them. Daniel's older brother, Richard, learned that lesson well. Where Daniel had inherited their father's warmth, Richard had inherited their mother's hunger. He looked at the company not as a legacy to protect but as a prize to claim. He had plans, always plans, and in those plans Helen was an inconvenience at best. He tolerated her the way you tolerate a draft in an old house, vaguely annoyed, certain it could be sealed up eventually. The only Carter who ever truly looked at Helen and saw a person was the man at the very top, Daniel's father, Arthur. Old Arthur Carter was proud, stubborn, and difficult, but he was not blind. He noticed how the books at the company suddenly ran cleaner after Helen married into the family. He noticed that the quiet daughter-in-law his wife dismissed had a mind for numbers that none of his own children possessed. He noticed. He just never said so out loud. And that silence would cost his family more than any of them could imagine. For a while, the marriage was good. Helen and Daniel built a quiet, comfortable life on the edge of the family's world, close enough to be present, far enough to breathe. Helen kept working, kept saving, kept that careful eye on every dollar that passed through her hands. And though the family never knew it, she was becoming something none of them expected. Not just frugal, but shrewd. She made small investments, then larger ones. She bought a little property here, a small stake there. She read everything she could about how fortunes were built and, more importantly, how they were lost. She was not greedy. She did not crave wealth for its own sake. She craved security, the one thing her childhood had never given her, the solid ground beneath her feet that no proud family could ever pull away. And piece by quiet piece, she was building it. In those early years, the family treated Helen's careful habits as a kind of quaint embarrassment. Patricia would remark, just loud enough to be heard, that some people simply did not understand how to live, that counting coins was the mark of a small mind and a smaller upbringing. Richard would smirk when Helen turned over a price or questioned a figure, as though thrift were a disease one caught from being born without money. They did not see what Helen was actually doing. They did not understand that every dollar she set aside, every modest stake she took, every careful study she made of how wealth survived and how it died, was a foundation being poured beneath a house none of them could see. They mistook her caution for poverty of spirit. In truth, it was the opposite. It was a discipline so complete that it would one day hold their entire world in its hands. Then came the year the ground shifted under the Carters, and everything Helen had quietly become was put to the test. It started the way these things often do, slowly, then all at once. The lumber company that had carried the family name for generations began to struggle. The market turned. Bigger competitors moved in with lower prices and deeper pockets. Old Arthur, too proud to admit weakness, hid the truth from everyone, even his own sons, while he borrowed against the company, then against the family home, then against the future itself. By the time the danger became impossible to hide, the situation had grown grave. The bank was circling. The debts had stacked into a number that made grown men go pale. And the great Carter family, with all its pride and all its history, stood weeks away from losing everything. The name. The company. The house. All of it. What very few people understood, then or later, was just how close the edge had truly been. The numbers Arthur hid were not the kind a family quietly recovers from. They were the kind that end dynasties, that scatter children, that turn proud names into cautionary tales whispered at other people's dinner tables. The bank had already begun the cold paperwork that precedes a seizure. There were men in good suits who had started speaking of the Carter holdings in the past tense. Arthur, who had spent his whole life believing that pride and a good name were enough to weather any storm, discovered in those weeks that pride pays no debts and a good name secures no loans. He was a drowning man who had spent decades insisting he could swim, and the water was finally over his head. He had run out of everything but time, and even that was nearly gone. What happened next is the secret at the center of this entire story, the secret the family would not learn for decades. While Arthur stayed up at night staring at numbers he could not solve, while Patricia clung to appearances and Richard quietly wondered what he could salvage for himself, one person in that family actually understood the machinery of money well enough to act. Helen. She went to Arthur, privately, and she did not lecture him or shame him. She simply laid out a plan. There was a way to save the company and the house both, she told him, but it would require moving fast, moving quietly, and trusting her completely. Arthur, cornered and desperate and out of options, did something he had never done before. He looked at his overlooked daughter-in-law, and he trusted her. It was the smartest decision he ever made, and he would never tell a living soul about it. What Helen did over the following weeks was nothing short of remarkable. Using the savings she had quietly built, the investments that had quietly grown, and the connections she had quietly made among the very bankers the family looked down upon, she did not simply lend the Carters money. She was far too careful for that. Instead, she bought it. She purchased the debt the bank held against the company. She purchased the mortgage on the family home. And when the dust settled, when the danger had passed and the Carter name was safe once more, the truth was simple and astonishing. Helen Carter now legally owned the company her family ran. She owned the house her family lived in. She held the controlling stake in everything the Carters believed was theirs. And not one of them, save for old Arthur, had the faintest idea. She could have used that power. She could have walked into that grand front room and announced to Patricia, the woman who had frozen her out for years, that the very floor beneath her feet now belonged to the girl she had dismissed. She could have humbled Richard, silenced the whispers, demanded the respect she had earned 100 times over. But Helen did none of those things. Because Helen did not want the family's gold. She wanted the family. She wanted to belong, truly belong, and she understood something the proud Carters never would. That power announced is power resented, and power resented is power soon undone. So she kept her secret. She let Arthur believe, in his final years, that he had saved the company himself. She gave a dying man back his pride, and she asked for nothing in return. It was the kind of mercy that should have bought her a lifetime of loyalty. It did not. And here it is worth pausing, because this is the moment that quietly decides everything that follows. Helen made a choice in those years that most people, handed the same power, would never make. She had saved a family that never thanked her, rescued a fortune from people who looked down on her, and then she chose to remain invisible inside her own miracle. Why? Because she believed that love freely given was worth more than gratitude demanded. She believed that if she simply kept giving, kept serving, kept proving her worth, the family would one day open the door and let her in. It was a beautiful belief, and it was a costly one. Because the Carters did not read her endless patience as virtue. They read it as permission. Every kindness she offered without condition taught them she could be taken from without cost. Her mercy did not soften them. It emboldened them. Old Arthur passed away a few years later, carrying Helen's secret with him to the grave, exactly as he had promised. And with his death, the last person in the family who knew the truth, the last person who saw Helen clearly, was gone. Whatever quiet protection his knowledge had offered her went into the ground with him. Patricia, now the unquestioned head of the family, settled into her grief and her authority with equal comfort. Richard tightened his grip on the day-to-day running of the company, never once suspecting whose company it truly was. And Helen, the silent owner of it all, faded further into the background, content to watch over her family from the shadows, asking for nothing, taking nothing, certain that her quiet sacrifice had built something permanent. She believed she had earned her place at last. She was about to discover how little her place was worth to the people she had saved. The years that followed were not kind to the marriage. Time and family pressure are patient forces, and they wear down even the strongest bonds. Daniel, who had once defied his entire family to marry Helen, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to bend. It was never one large betrayal. It was 1,000 small surrenders. He stopped defending her when Patricia made her cutting remarks. He stopped sitting beside her at family gatherings when his mother arranged the seating to exclude her. He let the silences grow. He told himself it was easier this way, that keeping the peace was a kind of love, that Helen understood. But Helen understood far more than he realized. She watched the man who had once seen her so clearly slowly forget how to look at her at all. And though it broke something deep inside her, she stayed. Because she still believed, against all the evidence, that he would remember. The thing that finally set the betrayal in motion was the oldest poison in any proud family. The question of legacy. Patricia, growing older now, became consumed by the future of the Carter name. She wanted heirs. She wanted the family line carried forward, the company passed down, the great tradition preserved. And in her cold accounting of these things, Helen had failed. Helen and Daniel had no children, and to Patricia this was not a private sorrow to be met with compassion. It was a flaw in the machine. A failure of duty. In Patricia's mind, Helen had taken her son, contributed nothing of pedigree, and now could not even secure the family's future. The conclusion she reached was as ruthless as it was simple. Helen had outlived her usefulness. And a woman who has outlived her usefulness, in a family like the Carters, is a woman who can be removed. So Patricia began to plan, and in her older son Richard she found a willing partner. Richard had his own reasons. He had long dreamed of consolidating the family's holdings, of putting the company and the house and the fortune firmly under the family's direct control, with himself at the center of it all. A fresh start for the family, a clean slate, suited his ambitions perfectly. Together, mother and son arrived at a plan so cold it is difficult to say aloud. They would find Daniel a new wife. A younger woman, suitable in the ways they cared about, capable of giving the family the heirs and the image it craved. They would ease Helen out quietly, with a divorce and a small settlement to keep her silent, and they would install the new bride in her place. And they would do all of this, they decided, before Helen ever understood what was happening. The younger woman they chose was named Vanessa Lane. And it would be easy, in a story like this, to make Vanessa a villain. But the truth, as it so often is, was more complicated. Vanessa was young, ambitious, and dazzled by the wealth and history the Carters wore like a crown. She was told a story, the family's carefully arranged version, in which Daniel's marriage was already a hollow formality, in which Helen was a cold and distant wife on her way out the door, in which Vanessa was not breaking apart a family but completing one. She believed it because she wanted to believe it, and because the people telling it were powerful and persuasive. Was she innocent? Not entirely. But she was also a pawn, moved across the board by hands far more practiced than her own, and she did not yet understand the game she had been placed inside. What followed was a slow and deliberate campaign to erase Helen Carter from her own life, conducted with the smiling cruelty that only a proud family can manage. It began with small things, the way these things always do. Vanessa started appearing at family gatherings, introduced first as a friend, then as a guest of honor, then as something the family pointedly refused to name. Helen would arrive to find Vanessa seated in her place. She would reach for her usual role at the holiday table and find it quietly given away. Conversations would stop when she entered a room and resume when she left. Her opinions, never much valued, were now ignored entirely. Daniel, caught between the wife he had vowed to honor and the family he could not stand against, did the most cowardly thing of all. Nothing. He watched it happen, and he let it happen, and his silence was its own kind of answer. For weeks, Helen absorbed it all without a word. To the family, her silence looked like defeat. They mistook her composure for surrender, her stillness for weakness, exactly as they had always mistaken her. They did not understand that they were watching a woman who had spent her entire life learning to read a situation before she acted, a woman who counted every cost before she moved. Helen was not breaking. She was thinking. She was watching the family reveal, day by day, exactly who they truly were beneath the smiles and the history and the pride. She was seeing, with terrible clarity, the worth they placed on 30 years of her loyalty and one quiet, world-saving sacrifice they did not even know she had made. And somewhere in those long, silent weeks, the woman who had only ever wanted to belong began, at last, to let that wish go. There was one private moment, late one evening, when the composure cracked. Alone in the house she secretly owned, surrounded by the furniture and the photographs and the slow ticking of an old family clock, Helen finally let herself feel the full weight of it. The man she had loved had forgotten her. The family she had saved was discarding her. The life she had built with such patient care was being dismantled around her, and the people doing it felt nothing but satisfaction. For one long moment, in the empty quiet, she allowed herself to grieve. And then she did what she had always done. She dried her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and turned her sharp, careful mind toward the problem in front of her. Because Helen Carter had not survived a hard childhood, a cold family, and a fading marriage by falling apart. She had survived by being smarter than the people who underestimated her. And she was about to remind them why. Then came the day the family stopped pretending. Richard arrived at the house, papers in hand, with the brisk confidence of a man delivering a foregone conclusion. The papers were a divorce agreement, and beside it sat an offer, a settlement, a sum of money the family considered generous and Helen considered insulting, a small payment in exchange for her quiet, permanent disappearance. Richard slid the documents across the table and explained, in the patient tone one uses with a child, that this was for the best. That the family had made its decision. That Helen would be provided for and could move on. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. They were offering her a fraction of a fortune, a handful of coins from a treasury, never once suspecting that the treasury itself was hers. They believed they were giving her something. In truth, they were handing the deed to their own undoing across a kitchen table. Helen looked at the papers for a long moment. She looked at Richard, with his confident smile and his certainty that the matter was settled. And then she did something that surprised him. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not refuse. She simply asked for 1 week to think it over. Richard, delighted that there would be no scene, no resistance, no ugliness, agreed at once. To him it was proof that Helen knew her place, that she would take the money and vanish exactly as planned. He left the house that day feeling victorious. He did not notice the calm in Helen's eyes, the particular stillness of a person who has finally decided to act. He did not understand that he had just given his quiet, overlooked sister-in-law the one thing she needed most. Time. And the moment the door closed behind him, Helen reached for the phone. The person she called was the only true friend she had in the world, a woman named Margaret Hale. Margaret was Helen's attorney, but she was far more than that. The two had known each other for decades, since the long-ago days when a young Helen first walked into Margaret's office with a folder full of careful plans and a quiet determination that Margaret had never forgotten. It was Margaret who had helped Helen, all those years ago, quietly purchase the debt and the mortgage that saved the Carter family from ruin. It was Margaret who had kept the documents safe, locked away, waiting for a day everyone hoped would never come. And it was Margaret who answered the phone that evening and listened, in growing astonishment and growing anger, as Helen calmly described how the family she had rescued now planned to discard her. When Helen finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Margaret asked one simple question. "What do you want to do?" That week, the one Helen had asked Richard for so she could think it over, was not spent in indecision. It was spent in preparation. While the family believed she was somewhere quietly grieving, packing her things, making peace with her own removal, Helen was doing what she had always done best. She was getting her affairs in perfect order. She met with Margaret in long, careful sessions. She reviewed every document, every signature, every link in the chain of ownership, making certain there was not a single gap a desperate family could exploit. She quietly confirmed the standing of the accounts. She prepared, with the patience of a woman who had spent decades counting every cent, for a conversation she had hoped never to have. The family thought they had given her a week to surrender. In truth, they had given her a week to make her victory absolute. By the time it ended, there was nothing left to chance. To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand the power Helen actually held in that moment, power the family could not begin to imagine. With a single afternoon's work, Helen could have ended the Carters entirely. She could have called in the ownership of the company and removed Richard from the business he believed he controlled. She could have asserted her title to the family home and lawfully turned every last one of them out into the street, the proud Patricia included. She could have frozen the accounts that funded their comfortable lives, exposed the borrowing that old Arthur had hidden, and revealed to the entire community that the great Carter fortune had been quietly owned, for decades, by the very woman they treated as nothing. The family that thought it was removing a powerless wife had, in truth, been living inside her house, spending her money, and running her company the entire time. And now they had made an enemy of her. But here is where this story turns away from the easy path, the path of pure revenge, and becomes something deeper and far more human. Because when Margaret asked what she wanted to do, Helen did not answer right away. She sat in the quiet of the house she owned, the house full of a lifetime of memories both bitter and sweet, and she thought not about what she could do, but about what kind of person she wanted to be. She had spent her whole life being underestimated. She had absorbed cruelty with grace and answered exclusion with patience. And now, with the power to repay every wound 100-fold, she found herself wrestling with the hardest question of all. Was vengeance worth becoming the very thing the Carters had always accused her of being? Was she willing to burn down everything she had spent 30 years protecting, just to watch the people who hurt her stand in the ashes? While Helen wrestled with that question, the family, certain of their victory, made a fatal mistake. They got greedy, and they moved too soon. Believing Helen as good as gone, Richard decided not to wait the full week. He went to the bank to begin what he called the transition, to put the company and its accounts more firmly under his own direct control before the new chapter of the family began. He sat across from a bank officer, full of confidence, and explained what he wished to do. And the bank officer, a careful man who knew exactly whose name sat at the top of every relevant document, listened politely, then explained, with great delicacy, that Mr. Richard Carter did not have the authority to do any of the things he was describing. That authority belonged to someone else entirely. Richard demanded to know who. The officer hesitated, then said the name. Helen Carter. And in that moment, the first crack appeared in the family's certainty. Picture Richard in that quiet office, a man who had walked in believing himself the master of a fortune, suddenly told by a soft-spoken stranger that he held no authority over any of it. He laughed at first. He told the officer there had plainly been an error, that the Carter holdings had belonged to the Carter family for 3 generations, that everyone in the county knew it. The officer did not argue. He simply turned his screen, or his ledger, or whatever record sat before him, and let Richard read it for himself. And Richard, scanning line after line for his own name, for his mother's name, for any Carter name at all, found instead the same two words repeating like a heartbeat through the entire history of everything he thought he owned. Helen Carter. He left without another word. But the certainty he carried in was gone, and something cold had taken its place. Richard left the bank shaken but not yet defeated. He convinced himself there had been some mistake, some confusion, some clerical error that the family's lawyers would untangle in an afternoon. He went searching through old company records, through the family's files, looking for the documents that would prove the Carters owned what they had always assumed they owned. And to his enormous relief, he found something. An old, official-looking paper, yellowed with age, that seemed to confirm the family's ownership of the company and the home. He carried it to Patricia like a trophy. "See," he told her, "it is all a misunderstanding. The company is ours. The house is ours. Whatever that bank officer thinks he knows, the documents prove otherwise." Mother and son convinced themselves the danger had passed, that Helen's strange calm meant nothing, that the plan could proceed. They had no idea that the paper Richard clung to was worth less than the ink it was printed in. When Margaret reviewed a copy of that document, obtained quietly through channels Helen still controlled, she went very still. Then she almost laughed. The paper Richard treasured was old indeed, a relic from before the company's near collapse, a record of an ownership that had ceased to exist the moment Helen purchased the debt and the mortgage all those years ago. It was a photograph of a world that no longer existed. The family was building its confidence on a foundation that had been quietly replaced beneath their feet decades earlier, and they did not even know the renovation had occurred. Margaret laid out the truth for Helen, document by document, an unbroken chain of legal ownership leading from that desperate year of rescue all the way to the present day. The deed to the house. The controlling stake in the company. The accounts. Every thread of it ran back to a single set of signatures, and every signature read the same. Helen Carter. And then there was the matter of Daniel. Of all the threads in this story, his was the most painful and the most uncertain. When word of the trouble at the bank reached him, Daniel finally stirred from his long, cowardly silence. But here is the bitter truth. His first reaction was not concern for Helen, not shame for how he had treated her, not love rekindled by the threat of loss. His first reaction was fear for himself, fear of scandal. Fear of what it would mean for his standing, his comfort, his place in the family, if the carefully arranged plan came undone. For a long and terrible stretch, even Helen could not say with certainty which way her husband would turn. Would the man who had once defied his whole family to marry her find his courage at last? Or would he, when the moment of truth arrived, side once more with the family that had only ever asked him to abandon her? That question hung over everything. It is worth sitting with Daniel for a moment, because he is the easiest character to hate and the hardest to understand. He was not a cruel man. He had never schemed against Helen, never spoken the cutting words his mother specialized in, never plotted like his brother. His sin was quieter and, in its own way, worse. He was a man who knew the right thing and lacked the courage to do it. Every time he chose silence over his wife, he told himself a small, comforting lie. That it would blow over. That Helen was strong enough to bear it. That standing against his family would cost more than it was worth. And those small lies, told often enough over enough years, hardened into a kind of paralysis. By the time it mattered most, Daniel had practiced cowardice for so long that he no longer remembered how to be brave. The tragedy of Daniel Carter is that he loved Helen the entire time, and let her be destroyed anyway. Through all of this, Helen remained outwardly calm, and the family mistook her calm, as they always had, for acceptance. So when Patricia decided to host a grand celebration, a gathering to formally introduce Vanessa to the wider family and friends and to mark the beginning of the Carters' bright new chapter, she did something almost unbelievable in its arrogance. She invited Helen. It was meant as a final humiliation, a way to parade the new bride before the woman she was replacing, to make Helen watch her own erasure with a glass of wine in her hand. Patricia expected Helen to either refuse the invitation in defeat or attend in quiet misery. Helen did neither. She accepted graciously. She told Patricia she would not miss it for the world. And she meant every word. Because Helen had finally decided what she was going to do, and the celebration would be the stage on which she did it. The night of the celebration arrived, and it returned us to the very room where this story began. The long, candlelit dining room. The expensive china. The proud portraits of Carter's past lining the walls. The family gathered in their finest, glasses raised, with Vanessa seated in the place of honor and the air thick with the satisfaction of a plan about to be completed. Patricia presided over it all like a queen on the eve of her triumph. Richard wore the confident smile of a man who had convinced himself the bank had simply been confused. And Daniel sat among them, pale and quiet, unable to meet his wife's eyes. Into this scene walked Helen composed and unhurried, and beside her, a guest no one had expected. A calm, sharp-eyed woman carrying a leather folder. Patricia frowned at the stranger but said nothing, unwilling to spoil her moment. She had no idea she had just allowed the instrument of her undoing to sit down at her own table. The dinner proceeded, and the family let their guard down completely, as people do when they believe they have already won. There were toasts to the future. There were pointed remarks about new beginnings and the importance of family. There were glances toward Helen, half pity and half contempt, as the assembled Carters waited to see how the discarded wife would handle her own funeral. Helen ate quietly. She smiled when smiled at. She let them have their performance, every cruel minute of it, because she understood the power of patience as no one else in that room ever could. And then, when the moment was right, when the toasts had been made and the family sat warm in their certainty, Helen set down her glass, and she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. She simply said that before the family closed one chapter and began another, there was something everyone deserved to understand. And the room went quiet. Margaret Hale opened the leather folder, and one by one, she laid the documents on the long table. The deed to the house in which they all sat, bearing Helen's name. The controlling ownership of the company that fed and clothed every Carter in that room, bearing Helen's name. The records of the accounts that funded their cars and their clothes and this very celebration, bearing Helen's name. She laid them down slowly, deliberately, in a silence so complete you could hear the candles burn. And as the meaning of those papers settled over the family like a slow tide, the expressions around the table began to change. The confident smiles faltered. The color drained from proud faces. Patricia stared at the documents as though they were written in a language she refused to read. Richard snatched up his treasured old paper, comparing it desperately against the dates on Margaret's documents, and watched in dawning horror as it crumbled into worthless history before his eyes. Helen let the silence do its work, and then she spoke again, and what she said struck deeper than any document. She told them the truth they had never known. That years ago, when the company was weeks from collapse and the family home was about to be lost, when old Arthur sat awake at night drowning in debts his pride would not let him confess, it was Helen who had saved them. Not the family's cleverness. Not the Carter name. Not some recovery they had earned. It was the quiet, overlooked daughter-in-law they had spent decades dismissing. Everything they were proud of, every inch of the legacy Patricia guarded so fiercely, every dream of the future Richard schemed to control, all of it stood on a foundation that Helen had built, in secret, and given to them freely, asking nothing, taking nothing, letting a dying man believe he had done it himself. The pride they wore had been her gift all along. The effect of those words was devastating in a way that no amount of money ever could be. Patricia, the woman who had frozen Helen out for 30 years, who had judged her unworthy of the Carter name, now sat in a house that the unworthy girl owned, at a table the unworthy girl owned, beneath portraits of ancestors whose legacy the unworthy girl had saved. The entire architecture of her pride collapsed in a single sentence. Richard, who had dreamed of controlling it all, understood at last that he had never controlled anything, that the company he ran had only ever been his to operate at the quiet pleasure of the sister-in-law he despised. And Vanessa, the young woman seated in the place of honor, looked around that table of stunned and silent faces and understood, with a sick and sudden clarity, exactly what she had been used for, and exactly who the real victim in this story had always been. It was Vanessa who moved first. In the heavy silence, the young woman rose from the seat of honor, the seat that had been Helen's, and she stepped away from it. She looked at the family who had recruited her with their flattering lies, and then she looked at Helen, and something passed between the two women that the Carters could not touch. Understanding. Vanessa, it turned out, was not entirely the villain the family had hoped to make of her, nor the innocent she had told herself she was. She was simply a young woman who had been shown a false picture and had finally seen the truth. Quietly, with a dignity that surprised even herself, she said that she was sorry, that she had not understood, that she wanted no part of what this family had done. And she walked away from the Carters and their tarnished crown, leaving the place of honor empty, where it belonged. Now came the moment the whole room was bracing for, the moment Helen had wrestled with in the quiet of that long week. She held every card. The family that had tried to erase her sat helpless before her, their pride in ruins, their future in her hands. She could turn them out of the house that night. She could remove Richard from the company by morning. She could leave Patricia, who had never shown her a single day's kindness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of her own cruelty. Every person at that table expected the blow to fall. They had treated her as merciless, and now they waited for the mercilessness they were certain she possessed. And in that long, suspended moment, Helen rose to her feet, looked at the people who had wronged her so deeply, and made her choice. The choice that is the true heart of this entire story. She did not destroy them. She told them, in a voice steady and clear, that she could end them all that very night, and that they had earned it, every cold smile and every cruel exclusion and every quiet betrayal of 30 long years. But she would not do it. Because she had spent her whole life refusing to become the thing they accused her of being, and she would not surrender that now, not even for the satisfaction of watching them fall. She would not let their cruelty turn her cruel. The power to destroy a person, she said, is not the same as the right to use it, and she had decided, long ago, what kind of woman she wished to be. The family stared at her, unable to comprehend a power that chose restraint, a strength that looked so much like grace. They had never possessed such a thing, and so they could not recognize it. Think about what Helen understood in that moment that her family never had. For 30 years, the Carters had measured strength in the things they could take. The bigger house, the older name, the seat at the head of the table, the power to decide who belonged and who did not. They had spent their whole lives accumulating, guarding, excluding, certain that this was what made a person strong. And in the end, all of that taking had made them small. It had made them the kind of people who would discard a loyal wife and call it strategy. Helen, who had been given so little and had given so much, understood the opposite. That the strongest thing a person can do is hold absolute power over someone who has wronged them, and choose to set it down. The Carters had spent a lifetime learning how to take. Helen, in a single evening, taught them what it looked like to be unbroken. But Helen was not finished, and what she revealed next was the final twist that no one in that room saw coming. She told them that for many years, quietly, she had arranged her affairs so that upon her death everything, the house, the company, the entire fortune, would pass to Daniel and to the Carter family. They had always been her heirs. Everything she had saved and protected and secretly held was going to come back to them in the end, freely, lovingly, as the final gift of the woman they could not be bothered to value. Their betrayal had not cost them a fortune they were about to lose. It had cost them a fortune they were always going to inherit. They had reached out to steal what was already, in time, going to be given. And then, in front of all of them, Helen told them that this arrangement no longer stood. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. She had finally seen them, and she would not leave her life's work to people who would treat a wife the way they had treated her. Instead, she said, the fortune would go to something worthier. She would build a foundation in the name of old Arthur Carter, the one member of the family who had ever trusted her, who had ever looked at her and seen the truth, who had carried her secret to his grave with honor. Through that foundation, the wealth she had quietly built and quietly protected would go on doing good long after everyone in that room was gone, helping people the way Helen herself had once needed help, lifting up the overlooked and the underestimated. The very people families like the Carters spent their lives looking down upon. The legacy the Carters had fought so hard to control would outlive them all, but it would not carry their pride forward. It would carry Helen's mercy. And in that decision, the woman they had tried to erase wrote herself into permanence in a way no Carter ever had. Then, at last, came Daniel. The husband who had stayed silent, who had bent and broken under his family's weight, who had let his wife be erased and said nothing, faced the only choice that had ever truly mattered. He looked at his mother and his brother, at the ruin of the family's pride and the wreckage of their plan. And then he looked at Helen, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years, and he saw again the woman he had once loved enough to defy the world for. Whatever battle had raged inside him during those long weeks of cowardice ended in that moment. Slowly, Daniel stood. He stepped away from the family that had asked him to betray his wife, and he walked toward Helen. It was too late to undo the harm. Some things, once broken, do not mend. But for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Carter chose her. Whether that choice could ever be enough was a question only Helen could answer. Helen turned, and she walked toward the door. The same door she had walked through as a hopeful young bride 3 decades earlier, the door of a house she had not known then she would one day own and one day leave. She walked out of that grand dining room with her head high, past the proud portraits, past the silenced family, past the empty seat of honor, and out into the cool night air. Behind her, the Carters sat small and stunned in the ruins of their certainty, their crown tarnished, their pride undone, their future in the hands of a foundation bearing the name of the only honest man among them. Daniel followed her out into the dark, an aging man chasing the wife he had nearly thrown away, and the story leaves them there, on the threshold, with the question of forgiveness still hanging unanswered between them. Some doors, once opened, can never quite be closed again. And so we are left with the questions this story asks of all of us. Helen Carter held absolute power over the people who had wronged her, and she chose mercy. She chose to walk away with her dignity rather than stay and rule through fear. Was she right to do it? Or did a family that could deserve to face the full weight of what they had done? Would you have forgiven Daniel, the man who stood silent for so long and found his courage only when it was almost too late? Or are some silences simply unforgivable, no matter how late the apology comes? There is no easy answer, and that is exactly why this story stays with you. Because somewhere in Helen's choice lives a truth most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. That real power is not what you take from people. It is what you choose not to take. If you were Helen, standing in that room, holding the deed to everything, looking at the faces of the people who tried to erase you, what would you have done? Would you have chosen mercy, the way she did? Or would you have demanded justice, and let the family that betrayed you face the consequences they earned? There is no wrong answer, and I truly want to know yours. Tell me in the comments below, because I read them, and stories like this one are only as rich as the conversations they spark. Helen spent her whole life being overlooked, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson buried in all of this. The people we underestimate, the quiet ones at the edges of the table, are so often the very ones holding everything together. We just never bother to ask whose name is really on the papers. And if a quiet, overlooked woman secretly owning everything surprised you tonight, then you will not want to miss the story coming next. It is the story of a man whose family wrote him out of the will and celebrated his disappearance, never once knowing that he held the single signature that controlled the entire family fortune, and what he chose to do when they finally came crawling back. It is a story of patience, of betrayal, and of a reckoning 30 years in the making, and it is every bit as remarkable as the one you just heard. So if you have not already, subscribe now, so that you never miss a single one of these true stories of betrayal, dignity, and the quiet strength of the people the world decides to overlook. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.